natural situation to start posing for an inanimate object, a camera.
Pattie Boyd lived at the center of one of the most envied love stories in rock history, caught between a Beatle and the guitarist who wrote Layla just to win her over. For decades, that triangle was treated like the ultimate rock and roll romance. But underneath the songs and the headlines was a version of events far darker than most fans ever imagined, one that wouldn't come fully to light for years. And once it did, it was impossible to hear those songs the same way again. And once it did, it changed the way an entire generation of fans would ever think about one of rock's most celebrated love stories again, the restless childhood behind her fame. Patricia, better known as Pattie Boyd, would eventually become one of the most recognizable faces of British fashion. But before she became a model, a Beatles wife, and a central figure in one of rock music's most famous love triangles, her childhood was anything but settled. Born in Somerset, England in 1944, Pattie grew up with a family that was constantly on the move. Her early years took her from Scotland and England to Nairobi and Nakuru in Kenya. She was raised across different countries and cultures, never really having one place she could call home. And strangely enough, those restless beginnings would eventually lead her straight into the heart of the British rock and roll world. When Pattie was just 8 years old, her parents sent her to boarding school near Nairobi. She was suddenly separated from her family, living far away from home while still just a child. Then, during one of her school breaks, she returned home and discovered that her parents had divorced. For a young girl already living so far from her family, it was another major change to absorb. Her parents officially separated in late 1953, and Pattie eventually returned to England with her mother, her new stepfather, and 2 younger half-brothers. She moved between several schools before finishing her education in 1961. Then, at just 17, she headed for London. That decision would change everything. London was buzzing with a new kind of energy. Fashion was changing, young people were breaking away from old traditions, and British culture was beginning to influence the world. Pattie arrived at exactly the right moment. It did not take long for people in the fashion industry to notice her. In 1962, she began working as a model, and what started as a new career quickly turned into something much bigger. Before long, she was working in both London and Paris, photographed by some of the biggest names behind the camera. Her face began appearing in major magazines, including Vogue, Vanity Fair, Elle, and Honey. Pattie was no longer just another young model trying to make it. She was becoming one of the defining faces of the era. Alongside Jean Shrimpton, she came to represent the new image of British femininity. The look was unmistakably mid-1960s. Short skirts, straight hair, big eyes, and a youthful innocence that seemed to capture exactly what the fashion world wanted. But Pattie's biggest transformation was still waiting for her. After appearing in a popular television commercial for Smith's Crisps, she caught the attention of director Richard Lester. He was working on the Beatles' first major film, A Hard Day's Night, and decided to cast Pattie in it. Her role was tiny. In fact, she had only one line. But that single appearance put her in the same world as the biggest band on the planet. And behind the scenes, something much more important was happening. Pattie had caught the attention of George Harrison. Just days after filming, she ended her relationship with her boyfriend and accepted George's invitation to go out. Their first date was surprisingly formal, considering what their relationship would eventually become. Brian Epstein, the Beatles' legendary manager, even chaperoned them during their first night together at the exclusive Garrick Club. But once that first date was out of the way, things moved quickly. Pattie and George became a couple, and almost overnight, the British press became fascinated with her. She was already a successful model, but being romantically connected to one of the Beatles pushed her into another level of fame entirely. Everywhere George went, Pattie could attract attention, and everywhere Pattie went, reporters wanted to know about George. Eventually, the attention became too much. George bought Kinfauns, a secluded house in Esher, Surrey, hoping to create some distance from the screaming fans and relentless photographers. Pattie moved in with him, and for a while, the house gave them something that was becoming increasingly difficult to find: privacy. But life at Kinfauns was not exactly quiet. In early 1965, Pattie and George attended a dinner party hosted by their dentist, John Riley. After dinner, Riley secretly added LSD to their coffee without telling them. Neither Pattie nor George knew what was coming. Once the drug took effect, the evening turned into something far more frightening than either of them expected. Pattie experienced an intense and disturbing hallucination. At one point, she came dangerously close to smashing through a shop window before George managed to pull her away. Later, while trapped inside an elevator, the group became convinced that the lift was on fire. The fear continued even after they got back on the road. Pattie later recalled being terrified while driving along the highway, convinced that she and everyone around her were about to disappear completely. It was an experience that could have gone very badly, but somehow Pattie and George made it through. And while that strange night revealed just how unpredictable their new life could be, it was nothing compared with what was waiting for them as their relationship moved deeper into the world of fame, music, and rock and roll excess. The woman behind George Harrison. On Christmas Day in 1965, George Harrison decided it was time to make things official. While he and Pattie Boyd were driving together, he popped the question. But before Pattie could even give him an answer, George pulled the car over and headed to the home of Beatles manager Brian Epstein. He wanted Epstein's blessing first. Once he got the green light, George returned to the car and asked Pattie properly. This time, there was no interruption. Pattie said yes. But the wedding that followed was far less glamorous than anyone might have expected for one of the world's biggest rock stars. The couple did not even wait a month. On January 21, 1966, George Harrison and Pattie Boyd were married at a simple registry office. There was no huge celebrity wedding and no grand church ceremony. The main touch of style came from the Mary Quant coats they wore. Pattie arrived in a red fox fur, while George wore black Mongolian lamb. Even the Beatles were not all there. John Lennon and Ringo Starr missed the ceremony, leaving Paul McCartney as the only other Beatle in attendance. For Pattie, the whole thing was a little disappointing. She had never been completely comfortable with the enormous attention that came with being George Harrison's wife. But even with all that pressure, she had imagined something more special for her wedding day. She had dreamed of a church ceremony, but Brian Epstein was concerned that a larger wedding would attract too much attention. So, instead of a grand celebration, Pattie became Mrs. Harrison in a quiet registry office. Outside that little ceremony, however, her fame was exploding. At the height of London's swinging 60s, Pattie Boyd had become one of the defining faces of British fashion. She was not simply following trends, she was helping create them. Mary Quant, the fashion designer who had dressed both Pattie and George for their wedding, saw Pattie as the perfect symbol of modern style. Cultural critics were just as impressed, regularly placing her among the most glamorous of the Beatles' wives. But there was much more to Pattie than clothes and photographs. In a 1966 interview with the Evening Standard, George openly credited her with broadening his world. Their relationship was not simply about Pattie standing beside a famous musician. George saw her as an equal partner, and in many ways, she was the one introducing him to new ideas and experiences. That influence became especially clear when the couple traveled to India later that year. George and Pattie spent 6 weeks there as guests of the legendary sitar player Ravi Shankar. During the trip, Pattie became interested in Indian music and even learned to play the dilruba. Her growing profile also gave her a platform of her own. She landed a fashion column in the American teen magazine 16, writing from London's Carnaby Street and covering the latest styles. She even reported on what the Beatles and Rolling Stones were wearing. For someone who had started as a young model trying to break into the industry, Pattie had come a remarkably long way. But fame had a darker side. The attention surrounding the Beatles was becoming impossible to escape, and Pattie was increasingly caught in the middle of Beatlemania. Crowds followed her. Photographers watched her. Her relationship with George was constantly under public scrutiny. Eventually, George pushed her to step away from modeling to help protect their private life. Pattie reluctantly agreed. Yet, while her fashion career was fading, her influence on George was moving in a completely different direction. By early 1967, Pattie had developed a deep interest in spirituality. She joined the spiritual regeneration movement and soon encouraged George to attend a lecture on transcendental meditation given by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi in London. That one decision would have consequences far beyond their marriage. George became fascinated by the Maharishi's teachings, and soon the Beatles' inner circle followed. In August 1967, they traveled to a seminar in Bangor, Wales, beginning a spiritual journey that would eventually take the Beatles much farther from home. Pattie was there at several of the moments that would become part of rock history. On June 25, 1967, she was present as the Beatles performed All You Need Is Love during the Our World satellite broadcast, a landmark television event watched around the world. Then, in early 1968, she traveled with George to the Maharishi's ashram in Rishikesh, India. Pattie documented much of the journey with her camera as the Beatles immersed themselves in meditation and Eastern spirituality. And while her influence on George was undeniable, the exact extent of her influence on his songwriting has become harder to separate from legend. Several Harrison songs have been connected to Pattie, including I Need You, If I Needed Someone, Love You Too, Something, and For You Blue. Some were clearly shaped by his personal relationships, while others have been linked to her over the years. The most famous example is Something. Pattie believed the song was written for her. George had reportedly told her directly that she was the inspiration behind it, and she considered the song deeply personal. But George later gave a different account, saying that Ray Charles had been the inspiration he had in mind. So even with one of the Beatles' most beautiful love songs, the story is not quite as simple as it first appears. What is clear is that Pattie had become deeply woven into George Harrison's personal and creative world. But behind the photographs, spiritual journeys, and beautiful songs, their marriage was beginning to crack. The couple who had once seemed completely inseparable were slowly moving in different directions, and before long, the same world of fame, music, spirituality, and temptation that had brought them together would begin pulling them apart. The love triangle that changed rock history. In March 1970, Pattie Boyd and George Harrison moved into Friar Park, a huge 25-bedroom Victorian neo-Gothic mansion in Henley-on-Thames. From the outside, it looked like the perfect home for one of rock music's biggest couples. But behind those enormous doors, things were already beginning to fall apart. George's growing devotion to the Hare Krishna movement was creating distance between them, while another painful reality was weighing heavily on their marriage. The family they had hoped to build simply was not happening. And then Eric Clapton entered the picture. By the late 1960s, Clapton had become one of George Harrison's closest musical friends. The two musicians wrote, recorded, and performed together, and their friendship seemed solid. But Clapton was hiding a secret. He had fallen completely in love with Pattie. At first, he tried to stay close to her without making his feelings too obvious. He even began dating Pattie's sister, Paula. But instead of making the situation easier, it only caused more pain. Pattie later believed the relationship badly damaged Paula's confidence and self-esteem. And then the situation became even stranger. Later in 1970, Pattie received an unusual letter in the mail. The handwriting was neat and sharply angled, and the message immediately raised questions. The writer wanted to know whether Pattie still loved her husband and warned her not to make a telephone call, insisting that a letter would be safer. Pattie read it several times, but still had no idea who had written it. At first, she was more amused than frightened. She assumed it had come from some obsessed stranger and showed it to George and their friends, treating the whole thing like the bizarre work of an anonymous admirer. Then, later that same evening, the phone rang. It was Eric Clapton, and he wanted to know if Pattie had received his letter. Suddenly, the mystery was solved. Clapton was the anonymous admirer, and he was no longer hiding how deeply he felt about her. When Pattie still did not respond the way he hoped, Clapton sent another letter. This time, his feelings were impossible to misunderstand. He addressed her as Layla and described a love so intense that he was willing to sacrifice everything for her. It was passionate, it was desperate, and depending on how the situation is viewed today, it was also deeply unsettling. But Clapton did not stop with letters. He was working on a song inspired by his feelings for Pattie, and before the track was released, he played the recording for her privately at a flat in South Kensington. The song was Layla. Pattie was stunned. She had never heard anything quite like it, and the intensity of the music left her overwhelmed. But instead of feeling flattered, her first reaction was embarrassment. She immediately worried that everyone would recognize the song was about her. Eventually, the tension became impossible to contain. At a party hosted by music executive Robert Stigwood, the love triangle finally exploded into the open. George arrived and found Pattie sitting with Eric Clapton in the garden. Clapton was pouring out his feelings to her, and George was furious. He confronted Pattie directly, forcing her to make a choice between him and Clapton. For that moment, Pattie chose her husband. She left the party with George, but Eric Clapton still refused to give up. After another rejection from Pattie, Clapton fell into an increasingly desperate state. At one point, he showed up at the Harrison home carrying a large supply of drugs and threatened to take the entire stash if Pattie would not leave with him. Pattie tried to intervene, but she could not control what happened next. Clapton's heartbreak soon became something much darker. His drug use developed into a serious addiction, and he began withdrawing from almost everyone around him. He stopped going out, stopped seeing friends, and isolated himself from the outside world. Pattie could only watch as the man who had once been one of rock music's brightest stars disappeared into addiction. And while Clapton was falling apart, Pattie's marriage was collapsing too. By May 1971, she decided she could no longer put her own life on hold. She returned to modeling and began rebuilding the career she had given up years earlier. But by 1973, the problems in her marriage had become impossible to ignore. Both Pattie and George became involved with other people. Pattie had a brief relationship with Ronnie Wood, while George became involved with Ronnie's wife, Chrissy. Pattie later joked that George had returned from India determined to live like Krishna, surrounded by women. The humor could only cover so much. The final breaking point came when George had an affair with Maureen Starkey, the wife of his own bandmate, Ringo Starr. When Pattie discovered the two together in a bedroom at Friar Park, something inside her finally snapped. She went upstairs, tore down George's sacred Om flag, and replaced it with a skull and crossbones flag. The message could hardly have been clearer. Her marriage was over in everything but name. And now that Pattie's heart was finally available, the rivalry between George Harrison and Eric Clapton took on an almost unbelievable new chapter. According to actor John Hurt, George and Clapton once found themselves together with guitars and small amplifiers. For roughly 2 hours, the two musicians played back and forth without saying much at all. It was less a conversation than a musical showdown. Two legendary guitarists, two old friends, and one woman at the center of their complicated history. Clapton later confirmed that the jam session really happened, although he played down the idea that it was literally a battle for Pattie. Still, the symbolism was hard to miss. On July 4, 1974, Pattie finally left George Harrison, but walking away was not easy. She found herself trapped between two men she had loved in very different ways. On one side was George, her husband, and the man she had built a life with. On the other was Eric, the man who had spent years chasing her and had turned his obsession into some of his most famous music. For the first time, Pattie chose Eric. Her divorce from George was finally completed on June 9, 1977. Considering everything that had happened between them, the divorce was surprisingly calm. There was no public war, no bitter fight over money, and no dramatic battle played out across the newspapers. Even Pattie's lawyer was reportedly impressed by how peacefully the two handled the separation. But the end of her marriage to George did not mean the end of the story. If anything, Pattie's influence on Eric Clapton's music became even more visible. After George married Olivia Arias in 1978, Pattie reportedly confided in Clapton about how deeply the news affected her. Clapton responded through music, writing Golden Ring from those emotions. Then there was Bell Bottom Blues, which grew out of a much simpler moment. Clapton had once given Pattie a pair of bell-bottom trousers after an encounter between them. For most people, it would have been an ordinary memory. For Eric Clapton, it became another song. By this point, Pattie Boyd had become much more than a model caught between famous musicians. Her relationships had become part of rock history, and her presence had inspired some of the era's most enduring songs. Somehow, after years of heartbreak, betrayal, addiction, and separation, fate seemed determined to bring Pattie and Eric Clapton back together. Pattie Boyd finally names her abuser, and fans are furious. When Pattie Boyd and Eric Clapton finally got married on March 27, 1979, many people expected the wedding to become the ultimate rock and roll showdown. After all, George Harrison had once been Clapton's closest friend, and then the two men had fallen into one of the most complicated love triangles in music history. But instead of causing a scene, George completely flipped the script. At the wedding, he was relaxed enough to joke about his unusual connection to the groom, calling Clapton his husband-in-law. He even made it clear that if Pattie was going to be with anyone, he would rather it be Clapton than some random fool. It was an unexpectedly peaceful ending to a story that had once been filled with jealousy, heartbreak, and betrayal. Still, the awkwardness never completely disappeared. As the years passed, Pattie began looking back at the beginning of her relationship with Eric and questioning what had really driven his obsession with her. Was Clapton truly in love with Pattie, or had part of his attraction come from wanting what George Harrison had? Pattie eventually began to suspect that George had been a bigger part of the equation than she once realized. In her view, Eric may have wanted her partly because she was George's wife. And once he finally had her, he seemed to struggle with what came next. Behind closed doors, their glamorous rock star marriage was becoming anything but glamorous. Pattie was struggling emotionally and began drinking heavily. Meanwhile, Clapton was battling his own serious addiction problems. Looking back, he admitted that he had mistreated Pattie during that period and recognized how deeply his addiction had affected their marriage. He even turned Pattie's drinking into music. The Shape You're In became a reflection of the problems he saw in her. In some ways, writing about Pattie's struggles was easier for Clapton than confronting his own. But then their marriage faced something far more painful than addiction or infidelity. They desperately wanted children. Pattie and Eric tried to make that dream happen through IVF treatments, first in 1984 and then again in 1987. Both attempts ended in miscarriage. For Pattie, the losses were devastating. She had grown up expecting that having children would simply be part of life. But when that future failed to happen, she was left dealing with a kind of grief that no amount of fame or money could fix. She eventually came to accept that motherhood might simply not be part of her story. But while Pattie was dealing with that heartbreak, Eric was living a separate life of his own. Clapton had been having an affair with Italian actress Lori Del Santo. The relationship went far beyond a brief romance when Del Santo became pregnant, giving birth to their son in 1986. For Pattie, that was the final betrayal. After everything they had already survived together, the addiction, the miscarriages, the emotional distance, and years of instability, there was simply nothing left to hold the marriage together. In April 1987, Pattie walked away from Eric for good. Their divorce was finally completed in 1989. After nearly 2 decades of relationships with two of rock music's most famous guitarists, Pattie Boyd was finally on her own. The woman who had once been at the center of one of the greatest love stories in rock history had survived 2 marriages, countless scandals, heartbreaking losses, and enough drama to fill a lifetime. But for the first time, the next chapter would belong entirely to her, the life she built afterwards. For the first time in decades, Pattie Boyd was no longer caught in the middle of a rock and roll love triangle, but freedom came with a strange feeling she had not expected. She felt completely lost. After spending so many years being known as George Harrison's wife and then Eric Clapton's wife, Pattie suddenly had to figure out who she was without either man beside her. At one point, she even called a friend and introduced herself as someone who used to be Pattie Boyd. She later admitted that she struggled with the question of identity. If she was no longer Mrs. George Harrison or Mrs. Eric Clapton, then who was she? For a while, that uncertainty hit hard, but Pattie did not stay there. Instead, she took everything she had been through and turned it into something useful. In 1991, she co-founded SHARP, the self-help addiction recovery program, alongside Barbara Bach, the wife of Ringo Starr. After years of watching addiction damage the people closest to her, Pattie was now trying to help others escape that same cycle. And then, almost unexpectedly, love found her again. That same year, she met property developer Rod Weston. For the first time in a long time, Pattie experienced a relationship that was not built around rock star fame, scandals, or the constant attention of the press. But there was another part of her past that had never really disappeared. For decades, Pattie had been quietly taking photographs of the world around her. She had captured George, Eric, the Beatles, and countless intimate moments that most fans never got to see. She was not trying to build a career as a photographer. She simply had a camera nearby and an instinct for knowing when a moment was worth capturing. Eventually, those photographs became something much bigger. In February 2005, her first major exhibition, Through the Eye of a Muse, opened at the San Francisco Art Exchange on Valentine's Day. The exhibition later traveled to cities around the world, including London, Dublin, Toronto, Sydney, and Almaty in Kazakhstan. And suddenly, people were seeing rock history through Pattie's eyes. What made the photographs so powerful was how natural they felt. Pattie was not staging celebrity portraits or trying to create perfect magazine images. She was simply photographing people when the light was right and the moment felt genuine. It took her until 2004 to feel ready to go through those old photographs again. When she finally did, she discovered something remarkable. The images had preserved a world that was already disappearing. The people had aged, some had died, relationships had ended, careers had changed. But inside those photographs, those moments were still alive. One of the most emotional memories came from George Harrison. Not long before his death in 2001, George visited Pattie and brought a few small gifts with him. They spent the day together, drinking tea and listening to music. For a little while, the complicated history between them seemed to disappear. There was no failed marriage, no painful divorce, and no old arguments. There were simply two people who had once loved each other, sitting together again after years apart. Later, while they were sitting in the garden, George looked around and noticed the flowers moving in the breeze. He described them as shivering. For Pattie, it was such a simple and strangely beautiful moment. It reminded her of the George she had known long before everything became complicated. Then, in August 2007, Pattie finally told her own story. Her autobiography, Wonderful Today, released in the United States as Wonderful Tonight. George Harrison, Eric Clapton, and me opened the door to decades of memories, heartbreak, fame, music, and complicated relationships. The book became a major success, reaching #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. Critics praised it for giving readers an unusually personal look into one of rock music's most famous romantic stories. But perhaps the biggest revelation was not George or Eric. It was Pattie herself. For years, she had been described as a model, a wife, or a muse. Her own story had often been pushed into the background, while the men around her received most of the attention. Her autobiography changed that. She finally took control of the narrative and showed that she had not simply been standing beside rock stars while history happened around her. She had been living through it herself. By 2007, Rolling Stone had recognized her as a legendary rock muse, while other critics described the complicated relationship between Boyd, Harrison, and Clapton as one of the most famous romantic entanglements in rock and roll history. Then came another unexpected chapter. On April 29, 2015, after 24 years together, Pattie Boyd and Rod Weston finally got married. And fittingly, they kept the ceremony simple. They married at a registrar's office, almost mirroring the quiet ceremony Pattie had experienced with George decades earlier. Weston joked that after nearly 24 years together, they figured it was probably time to make things official. After everything Pattie had experienced, the simplicity seemed almost perfect. Looking back over her extraordinary life, Pattie never seemed interested in pretending it had been perfect. There had been painful marriages, addiction, heartbreak, failed attempts to start a family, wild travels, affairs, spiritual journeys, and enough drama to fill several lifetimes. But she also had music, friendship, photography, new love, and countless unforgettable memories. And rather than wishing she could erase the difficult parts, Pattie looked back with a sense of gratitude. She believed she had lived an exceptional life and had been lucky in many ways. She also felt that she had a strange gift for ending up in the right place at exactly the right time. And looking at her story, it is hard to argue with her. From the fashion streets of 1960s London to the homes of the Beatles, from India to the biggest stages in rock history, Pattie Boyd was almost always somewhere close to the action. She was never just the woman standing beside the famous men. In her own quiet way, she was part of the story.